Somewhere in a dusty museum drawer, sealed for decades and barely glanced at by anyone, sits a piece of baked clay that once held the oldest fears humanity ever put into words. Not fears of monsters, not fears of war, fears of what happens the moment your heart stops and your eyes go dark. Today we're opening that story up, and by the end of this video, you'll understand something most people never learn in school. Nearly 4,000 years ago, in the land between two rivers, real people were already asking the exact same question you've probably asked yourself late at night. What's actually on the other side? Before we get into it, if stories like this pull you in, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. And if you're already hooked 30 seconds in, drop a like right now because that tells me you want more of this. Okay, let's go back to where it all started. The place is ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, roughly 4,000 years before your phone ever buzzed with a notification. The people there, the Sumerians, were among the first humans to write anything down at all. And when they wrote, they didn't just record grain shipments and tax lists. Buried among those everyday clay tablets are hymns, prayers, and myths that try to answer the one question every civilization eventually circles back to. What happens when we die? Their answer wasn't heaven. It wasn't hell either. They called it Kur, sometimes Urkala, and later scribes described it simply as the Great Below. It's one of the earliest written concepts of an underworld in human history, predating the Egyptian Book of the Dead by centuries. Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating and a little unsettling. The Sumerians didn't picture the afterlife as a place of judgment where good people float upward and bad people burn. Everyone went to the same place. Kings, farmers, priests, thieves. It didn't matter what you did in life. In Kur, the dead were described as wearing feathers like birds, wandering in darkness, eating dust, and drinking stagnant water. There was no punishment and no reward, just a gray, quiet continuation, stripped of status and stripped of comfort. Imagine spending your entire life building a name for yourself, only to be told that death treats a king and a beggar exactly the same way. That idea alone tells you something about how these people viewed fairness, mortality, and the fragile line between the living and the forgotten. Now, the most detailed description we have of this underworld doesn't come from a vague myth. It comes from one of the oldest stories ever written, a tale you might actually know part of already, the Epic of Gilgamesh. In its 12th tablet, Gilgamesh's companion Enkidu actually travels down into the underworld to retrieve something for his friend. But he breaks the rules of the dead, and Kur refuses to let him go. What follows is one of the most haunting passages in ancient literature, where Enkidu's spirit is summoned back just long enough to describe what he saw down there. He tells Gilgamesh that the more honor a person had in life, the more comfort they had in death, but the less anyone cared for them, the harsher the afterlife became. A man with many sons rested peacefully. A man who died alone with no one to remember him wandered eating scraps thrown in the street. It's not a moral punishment system. It's something closer to a reflection of how deeply human memory and legacy mattered to these people, almost like they believed the living could still shape the comfort of the dead simply by remembering them. There's another myth just as powerful, called the Descent of Inanna. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, deliberately journeys down into the underworld to challenge her sister, the Queen of the Dead. At each of 7 gates, she's forced to remove a piece of her clothing and jewelry, stripped layer by layer of her power, her identity, her divinity, until she stands before her sister completely vulnerable and is struck dead on the spot. It's a brutal, symbolic story about the price of ambition and the terrifying idea that even a goddess isn't safe from death's authority. Scholars have long noted the eerie structural similarity here. 7 gates, 7 layers of stripping away, an idea of gradual descent into judgment, and how these patterns echo forward for centuries into later Babylonian and even some early Greek concepts of the underworld. What makes all of this so gripping isn't just the mythology itself, it's what it reveals about the psychology behind it. These weren't people writing horror stories for entertainment. They were trying to process the same fear every human being eventually faces, using the only tools they had: clay, a stylus, and imagination shaped by real grief. Some historians believe these afterlife myths were also functional. meant to comfort mourners by giving death a shape, a place, a set of rules. Because an unknown void is far more terrifying than even a bleak, dusty underworld with a name. There's no official confirmation of what any single person genuinely believed happened after death, but the sheer consistency of these dark, joyless portrayals across multiple tablets suggests this wasn't a fringe idea. It was mainstream belief for an entire civilization, for over 1,000 years. So here's a question worth sitting with. If the very first people to write anything down chose to write about death, about what happens in the dark, what does that tell us about human nature itself? Are we hardwired to need an explanation, even a frightening one, rather than live with the unknown? I'd genuinely like to know what you think, so drop a comment below and tell me. If you had lived in ancient Sumer, would their vision of the afterlife have comforted you or terrified you? And if this kind of forgotten history fascinates you as much as it fascinates me, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. 4,000 years later, the clay has cracked, the cities have turned to sand, but the questions those ancient scribes carved into wet mud are still exactly the same questions we're asking tonight. Staring up at the ceiling, wondering what happens when the light finally goes out.